Hey guys, so you are now witnessing me do something that I have never really done before. I am actually redoing one of my older videos here, and for good reason. You see, a couple years back I did a review of The Exorcist, and it is probably one of the most poorly received videos I've ever done, and going back and watching it again, it's easy to tell why. It sucked. It was so unfocused. I wasn't using a script when I was recording it, and that was very, very obvious. I dicked around far too much, and when I finally got into my actual criticisms, they were way too vague, and I really didn't go into a whole lot of detail, so I sort of decided to redo that video. But this time with more organized thoughts and a more poignant approach to my actual criticisms, and explain more in detail why I think The Exorcist is one of the most overrated horror films of all time. Now, having said that, I want to establish I don't hate this movie. I don't even think it's a bad movie. Quite the opposite, actually. I think it's an exceptional film. But its status has been extremely overblown over the decades. And it is definitely a very flawed movie. I'll start out by saying that if you aren't familiar with The Exorcist, then I gotta say, saying that you live under a rock is inappropriate. That would actually be more akin to saying that the rock that you were living under was living under a rock. It is one of the most legendary films in the horror genre. It's based on a book by William Peter Blatty, which was supposedly based on a real case of demon possession, which I have a pretty hard time believing, but that's besides the point. The movie is about a family living in Washington, D.C. It's also about a priest on an archaeological dig and another priest who loses faith in God after watching his mother die and become an alcoholic. The main focal point of the movie, though, is that the youngest girl in the family living in D.C., a girl named Reagan, becomes possessed by the devil, and the two aforementioned priests have to exorcise the devil from her body. This movie was directed by William Friedkin, a director who is a real on and off guy with the audiences and critics. His other well-known movies are The French Connection and To Live and Die in L.A. So he's definitely made some really, really good movies, and he's also made a couple crappers, but every director does. Now, it's time to crack my knuckles and take this movie on in the ring and criticize the hell out of it. But before actually watching this movie for the first time, every person I heard who talked about this movie did nothing but go on and interject about how scary it was. I saw more than a couple of websites, magazines, etc. who listed this movie at the very top of their lists of the scariest movies ever made. The scariest movie ever made. Ooh. My favorite review stated that every single second of the movie was sheer, uncomfortable, white-knuckle terror. So after hearing all of that, my expectations for this film were inconceivably high. So yeah, I went into this movie pretty much, in a sense, expecting the scariest movie of all time. And when I finally did watch it for the first time, I was extremely disappointed. I just said to myself, this is what all the fuss was about. This is what everyone kept calling the most intense, violent, and shocking horror film ever committed to celluloid. Now, maybe I'm being a bit unfair. I'm sure this film was very effective back when it was first released. I mean, I've seen dozens of videos of people walking out of the theaters back in 1973 going up and down about how fucking horrifying the movie was. And in all honesty, for the early 70s, this movie probably was a pretty effective horror film. But time has clearly not been kind to it. The first major problem I have with this movie is that it is boring. This film is so poorly paced. It takes way too long to establish the characters and setting. I get it. Regan is a sweet, innocent, and kind little girl. Your ability to highlight who the demon is going to possess is uncanny, William Friedkin. Hell, even the opening scene with the priest, played by Max von Sydow, drags horribly before they get to that eerie-looking statue. I watched this guy dick around a huge-ass dig site for almost 20 goddamn minutes just for a small 40-second scene of foreshadowing with the creepy-ass music as Father Merrin has a staring contest with a goofy-looking demon statue. This movie has horrible pacing, which is emphasized even further when we finally get to see Regan possessed by the fucking demon. We get to see all the famous shock scenes. When I got to the scenes that everyone kept talking about, the scene where Regan crawls backwards down the stairs, the scene where she stabs herself in the vagina and brutally assaults her own mother while making all the furniture levitate, I was invested in all these scenes. And you know what the filmmakers did? They showed all these scary scenes of demon possession, and then they just cut away to a different scene that has nothing to do with what we just saw happen. In the aforementioned scene where Regan hits her mom and twists her head around, that scene immediately cuts to a scene where Regan's mom is talking with the drunk priest guy, Father Karras, played by Jason Miller. What the fuck? I cannot stand it in movies where the characters are forced into a difficult predicament only to cut to a next scene where they magically figured it out on their own off screen. That is bullshit. You don't write these big shocking set pieces only to transition to another scene where the characters are all fine and act like nothing ever happened. How did Regan's mom get out of her room while she was going on her possessed rampage, especially considering the fact that she blocked the door with a huge dresser? When you write a story like this, but then immediately drop these sequences in the very next scene without them having any huge impact on the characters or the plot, that is spectacularly lazy storytelling. And the first two acts of The Exorcist are just that. We get more and more boring, drawn-out scenes, Regan goes on a possessed tirade, and then it's back to the boring shit. Oh, look, she pissed herself. Never mind about that. Oh, look, she's crawling backwards down the stairs. Oh, whatever. How did this movie get nominated for Best Picture again? Now, as much as I've complained about this movie, the third act is really actually where the movie finally starts to pick up some momentum and actually maintains it rather than coming to a complete stop like it did so many times before. When Karras and Merrin team up to exorcise Regan, I gotta admit it, it's a powerful and pretty fucking amazing sequence. It's far from what I would consider scary, but it is definitely intense and packed full of incredible imagery, cinematography, special effects, you name it. It's one of the most incredible scenes in film history, and you would have to be a dumbass to think otherwise. That is what I was waiting to see. This is what I had to wade through the first hour and a half of dull, boring dreck in order to finally see. These are the reasons why I think The Exorcist is a good movie overall, but not even close to being what I would call a horror movie. The first two acts are dull and uneven as all hell, and the last 40 minutes, as amazing as they were, they never even approached being a little scary. That's the reason why I say this movie hasn't aged well. It's because since its release, there have been numerous other horror movies that have bested it in actually being horror movies. And compared to all those movies, this one just doesn't really measure up. Another big flaw in saying that this movie is scary is that whether or not it scares you kind of completely depends on if you are religious or not. And even then, it doesn't work that well. According to most real, and I use the word real very loosely, demon possessions, there have been no instances of demon-possessed people having their faces turned into hideous monster faces or shouting over-the-top obscenities or spouting giant streams of puke out of their mouths. The demon possession in this movie is beyond exaggerated and fantastical, so whether you are religious or not, this movie is completely unrealistic. Bottom line, this movie did not scare me. I was not even a little bit affected by this movie when I first watched it, but as much shit as I've been giving this movie, I'm not going to blame it for my lack of fear. I'm going to blame the retards who hailed it as the scariest movie of all time. On what planet is this the scariest? I can name a dozen movies that are more qualified for that title. The likes of Halloween, Alien, The Thing, Suspiria, Poltergeist, Nosferatu, Cape Fear, Les Diaboliques, Evil Dead, Phantasm, Eyes Without a Face, Peeping Tom, Carrie. These are all terrifying films that have all stood the test of time and are all equally more worthy of the scariest film of all time title than the freaking Exorcist. This movie is not scary. Even The Omen, which came out 3 years later, was scarier. Now that I've complained endlessly about this movie, it's time for me to actually laud it some praise. As uneven as the script is, William Friedkin still does a very good job as director. That is, when the script allows him to. The performances are all very good, but the characters are simply not interesting enough to justify the excessive screen time they are given to just mess around and do nothing. The music is great. If there's one thing about this movie that I think deserves all the praise it gets, it's the soundtrack. It's fantastic. The music is brilliant, and it's one of the things that made the film somewhat bearable for me. The last thing to compliment is the visual effects. The guy for creating the look of the possessed Reagan is Dick Smith, a makeup artist who worked on The Godfather, Taxi Driver, and won an Academy Award in the 80s for the movie Amadeus. I can guarantee that if they had a category for makeup in the Oscars during the 70s, Smith would have won it for The Exorcist because his work on Linda Blair is freaking stellar. It's one of the most iconic makeup performances for a very good reason. Linda Blair sold the role, and Dick Smith sold the makeup for sure. All the other special effects in this movie are also incredible. One of the things that immediately caught my attention during the incredible climax was how whenever the actors talked inside the room, you could actually see their breath. I cannot imagine how cold they were in that room. But it looked really goddamn impressive. The production values in this movie were second to none back when it was released, and they still look amazing even to this day. So those are my more explicit thoughts regarding The Exorcist. In terms of horror films, it's lackluster and doesn't even come close to deserving its reputation, due to taking far too long to establish the characters and plot and inserting numerous moments of scares that don't go anywhere. I realize in order to be scary, a horror film has to have build-up and suspense, but there's a difference between creating build-up and dragging your feet. And when some of that build-up leads to scenes of horror that are ultimately impotent and have no effect on what happens next, then you have ruined your build-up. And the rest of the movie is a tedious, repetitive chore. Now, as far as being a thriller or drama, The Exorcist is quite good. Not great, but good. I'm really trying to stress the fact that I came really close to hating this movie until it got to the end. The final act of this movie kicked so much ass, and it was so great that it kind of made up for the snooze fest that was the first two acts. So the question is, do I recommend this movie? Yeah, I'd say I can probably recommend it. One last thing though, avoid the sequels, especially the second one. But yeah, I can say that it's worth watching at least once. Although, I am warning you, prepare to be bored for a majority of the film, but I swear to God, the final part is worth it all. It's worth seeing just for the climax. And that's everything I have.